In 1978, Pope John Paul II created history by becoming the first non-Italian pope in almost 4 centuries. He was a man who made a significant impact on both the global and ecclesiastical histories. The Old Father raised himself to the face of God and spoke his final words to the world, even though his eyes were tired, his breathing was becoming feeble, and his heart was fighting to stop beating. Before he passed away from illness in 2005, God saved him multiple times from death. What he reveals in his letter has the potential to alter the course of history drastically. He did not crumble even in the face of the horrific assassination in St. Peter's Square. Is this the work of divine magic? Up until now, everything about this pope has taken the world by surprise. Join us in this video as we expose all of the secrets in Pope John Paul II's final communications. Significant loss characterized his early years. At the age of 9, his mother passed away, and at 12, his older brother also passed away. The following year, during the German occupation of Poland, the school was closed by Nazi forces. To become a priest, John Paul started attending a covert seminary that the Archbishop of Koch controlled. He completed his religious studies in a Krov seminary after World War II, and in 1946 he was ordained. Then, in 1958, he was appointed Bishop of Omi, and in 1964 he was named Archbishop of Krakow. In 1967, Pope Paul the Saxon elevated him to the rank of cardinal, and in 1978 he became the first non-Italian pope in almost 4 centuries. In his capacity as the head of the Catholic Church, he made trips to over 100 nations, sharing his message of peace and faith. Up to his death in 2005, he had a committed life. John Paul's health seemed to be deteriorating as he aged. He appeared shaky on his feet and moved slowly when making public appearances. He occasionally trembled visibly as well. Easter Sunday, March 27th, marked the pontiff's final public appearance. His tracheostomy prevented him from speaking to the assembly at St. Peter's Basilica, though he tried. In the end, John Paul the Saul only gave the pilgrims a hand benediction before returning inside. In addition, he spent all of his time composing messages for all of humanity and committing himself to God throughout this time of ill health. Only after his passing were these messages made public. At the age of 84, Pope John Paul II passed away at his Vatican City home on April 2, 2005. Before his funeral on April 8th, about 3 million people lined up at St. Peter's Basilica to bid farewell to their cherished holy leader. Breathing heavily, Pope John Paul II said his last feeble Polish words, "Let me go to the Father's house." After 6 hours, the unconscious Pope passed away. The Vatican just released a meticulously detailed official report on John Paul's final weeks, which includes an account of his final hours, perhaps an attempt to dispel any suspicions regarding his illness and death on April 2nd. In previous decades, there was a great deal of conjecture regarding the causes and manner of death of several popes. Conspiracy theories emerged during John Paul I's 33-day pontificate in 1978, claiming that the Vatican's account of his natural death in bed was false. Some questioned whether he knew anything about a scandal concerning the Bank of the Holy See. Although no one has openly raised concerns about John Paul II's last hours, the Vatican remained silent for years when it became clear to onlookers that the traveling pope was experiencing the signs of Parkinson's illness. The study details the symptoms, care, and reaction to the treatment of Pope John Paul II during his 2 hospital stays, and later during his final days in his apartment in Vatican City. After the 2nd hospital stay, which involved a throat operation on February 24th to place a breathing tube, John Paul's recovery was hindered by severe weakness, hard swallowing, difficult speech, and poor nutrition. According to the narrative, the 84-year-old Pope's swallowing and breathing problems were caused by the advancement of Parkinson's disease, which he had been suffering from for years. According to Polish tradition, a small lit candle brightened the twilight of the room where the Pope was passing away. In the Pope's last moments, a nun nearby heard him exclaim, "Let me go to the Lord." When John Paul died, he gazed towards the apartment window and said, "Amen." A Polish priest claimed that the Pope died an instant after making a big effort to say, "Amen." According to the Vatican, the Pope delivered his final comments around 3:30 p.m. He lapsed into a coma shortly before 7 p.m., and the Vatican press office confirmed his death at 9:37 p.m. On April 2, 2005, the day of his death, Pope John Paul II's message was given at the end of the first funeral service held in his honor. Archbishop Leonardo Sandri then read the text before reciting the Regina Cae, which substitutes the Angelus during the Easter season. The Pope had written to all of humanity, who so often appears lost and dominated by the power of evil, egoism, and fear. The risen Lord offers as a gift his love, which pardons, reconciles, and restores the soul to hope. It is a love that transforms hearts and brings serenity, how the world should understand and accept divine mercy. The Pope addressed the Gospel passage in which the risen Christ appears to the apostles and reveals his pierced hands in his text. Inside those glorious wounds that he made an incredulous Thomas touch 8 days later, reveal God's mercy, who so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. He said, "Lord, who with your death and resurrection revealed the Father's love, we believe in you, and with trust we repeat today, Jesus, I trust in you. Have mercy on us and on the entire world." The Pope never asked for anything personally in his final moments before turning to God, but instead prayed for the community and all of his sheep to be filled with God's grace and strength to resist temptation, because he believed that Satan would only grow stronger over time. He begged God to take him home with him in the end, when he was too weak to continue fighting. 4 times, God miraculously saved John Paul Theo from death before his time. Prior to his death at the age of 84 after a protracted illness, he reigned as Christ's vicar for over 26 years. Did you know he was almost killed at least 4 times throughout his life? Carl VOA, the future Pope John Paul II, first played with a rifle as a child when he was 15 years old. He frequently hung out with a friend after school whose family ran a pub. There was a local cop who occasionally drank at the bar while off duty, and if he felt too impaired by the drink, he would leave his gun in the cash drawer for safety. One day, his friend pulled the revolver from the drawer and pointed it at VOA, who was only a few feet away, saying, "Hands up or I'll shoot." The gun then accidentally fired, and despite being at practically point-blank range, the bullet narrowly missed VOA. In February 1944, he was run over by a Nazi truck during a Polish winter. WTIA was walking home from work at a quarry when he was hit by a Nazi truck. A woman saw the body and hurried to help him. Though they initially thought he was dead, they immediately realized that Wojtyla was comatose and severely hurt. She and a German officer flagged down a lumber truck driver, asking him to transfer him to a local hospital. When Wojtyla awoke, he was in a hospital, wrapped in bandages. His injuries included a severe concussion, a shoulder injury that resulted in a permanent stoop, and multiple wounds. He spent the following 2 weeks in the hospital recovering and reflecting on the peculiar ways of providence. The fact that he had survived this tragedy appeared to reinforce his priestly vocation, according to his biographer George Weigel. Shot by an assassin, this is perhaps one of the Church's nightmares, but it is also a time when God clearly demonstrated how he protected John Paul II. On May 13, 1981, at the Feast of Our Lady of Fatima, the pontiff was receiving pilgrims in St. Peter's Square in an open automobile when AKA fired 4 rounds at close range. All 4 shots struck John Paul II. This individual was swiftly apprehended and restrained, while John Paul II was transported to the hospital for emergency treatment. John Paul II genuinely believed that Our Lady of Fatima had saved his life, demonstrating how the Fatima's devotion and the Pope's physical protection have long been linked. For various reasons, the 1981 assassination attempt made history. It prompted the Vatican to significantly increase the pontiff's safety, including bulletproof glass, which has remained in place ever since. Until Pope Francis's election, John Paul II believed that Mary, in the figure of Our Lady of Fatima, had personally deflected the bullet that struck him, sparing his life. He gave a bullet found in the Pope's mobile to the local bishop in Fatima, who inserted it into the crown of the official image of Mary in the shrine of Fatima, which Pope Francis will visit. He was stabbed by a traditionalist priest who was worried about changes made to the church after Vatican II. For Juan María Fernández Cron, a Spanish priest, had extremist views after coming to believe that John Paul II was a communist agent out to destroy the church, and that communists had infiltrated the church. Fearing that a communist pope would undermine the church, Father Cron decided to take matters into his own hands and hatched a conspiracy to kill Pope John Paul II. He chose May 12, 1981, the day before the anniversary of John Paul II's first attempted assassination. Using a bayonet, Father Cron breached a security line during Mass in Fatima, Portugal, and the pontiff, who had just gotten over the previous attack, was stabbed to death. Security then restrained him. On the other hand, John Paul II conducted Mass as if nothing had occurred. Even though he had bleeding when he checked himself later, the pontiff chose to cover it up with a bandage and hide it. He covered it up so well that it wasn't even recognized by the general public that Father Cron had really stabbed him until 2008, when the incident was revealed in a documentary by the pontiff's former secretary. There have been other failed attempts against John Paul II in contemporary history besides these two. The first one happened in 1970, not long after Pope Paul VI arrived in the Philippines and was assaulted with a knife at the airport in Manila. Similar to what transpired with John Paul II's second attack, the Vatican and Pope Paul VI covered down the incident, with the latter only admitting his injuries after his passing. The legacy of Pope John Paul II. John Paul was a strong supporter of human rights who expressed his concerns about global suffering. He was a staunch opponent of the death penalty, among other things on which he held strong opinions. John Paul, a captivating individual, utilized his clout to effect political transformation, and is credited for having brought an end to communism in his own Poland. He wasn't without detractors, though. Some claimed that he could be unforgiving to anyone who disagreed with him, and that he wouldn't soften his hardline position on specific topics, like contraception. Other than Blessed Peter and St. Peter, John Paul II presided over the Catholic Church for a total of 26.2 years. He made over 130 country visits, produced over 50 significant works, canonized hundreds of saints, and appointed the majority of the current bishops of the Church over those 26 years. We are taught by God that if someone slaps you on your left cheek, give them the other. Indeed, in theory, but it's practically unfeasible. But this was done by Pope John Paul II. He delivered a message of forgiveness, calming everyone's ire and providing consolation to those who had wronged him. Would you happen to recall that fateful May 13th, 1981 day? From his open Pope-mobile, the Polish Pope was thanking the throngs of worshippers gathered in St. Peter's Square. 4 close-range bullets were fired abruptly, and the Pope-mobile was quickly driven away, while a group of security guards after it. John Paul II fell into the arms of his assistants. After being struck in the abdomen, left hand and right arm, our saint was taken to the Gemelli Hospital in Rome and had emergency surgery. As the faithful screamed and prayed that the Holy Father would survive the shooting, panic broke out in St. Peter's Square. The incident also injured 2 female bystanders. A correspondent from Vatican Radio covered the dramatic events of the afternoon live. For the first time, even the Vatican was discussing terrorism. If we were in his shoes, any of us would be furious with the assassin and want him to have the worst possible life. That kind of mindset is relatively common. However, Pope John Paul II made moves that stunned everyone. In a taped message delivered from his hospital bed on the Sunday morning following the shooting, the Pope asked the faithful to pray for the gunman, whom he called my brother, and expressed his heartfelt remorse. John Paul II recovered completely in a few weeks. He visited Ali Agca, his attempted assassin, in Rome's Rebibbia jail on December 27, 1983. At the request of John Paul II, Ali Agca was granted a pardon by then Italian President Carlo Azeglio Ciampi in June 2000, following nearly 20 years of a life sentence in prison in Italy prior to his deportation to Turkey. However, the story is not limited to these figures. The second half of the 20th century will be remembered as the period when Pope John Paul II was the most influential global leader. By supporting the Polish liberation movement and the labor union Solidarity, he altered the course of history and contributed to the end of the Cold War. This set off the domino effect that ultimately led to the fall of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. He was the ideal man to influence world history because he was in the right place at the right time. Against a backdrop of conflicting national and economic self-interests, Pope John Paul II stood as a prophetic voice for peace and humanity. However, John Paul's concern for the world extended beyond Eastern Europe. In the Middle East and the Third World in particular, he was a prophet for justice and peace in other regions as well. He was against preventative warfare, but in favor of humanitarian action. Concerned about how economic globalization might affect the impoverished in the developing world, he pushed wealthy nations like the US to contribute more liberally to development. In a world where national and economic self-interests were in conflict, he was a prophetic voice for peace and humanity. Although he had great admiration for the American people, he was not hesitant to question government actions that went against moral principles, be it the population programs of the Clinton administration or the Iraq wars of the two Bush administrations. John Paul will also be noted for significantly enhancing ties between Jews and Catholics. There will always be disagreements and conflicts, but there will be arguments between sisters and brothers rather than enemies. However, John Paul saw himself more as a teacher than as a politician or diplomat. He wrote everything from scholastic tomes to poetry musings. John Paul's incredibly effective pastoral travels to every country in the world will also be remembered. Millions of people flocked to hear him preach and join him in prayer. For what purpose did they emerge? A reed shook by the breeze. They came to witness a holy man, a man of principle and conviction, a man who had altered the path of history, and a man who cared about them. John Paul II was a steadfast supporter of human rights, and his altruistic deeds also established the framework for then-current foreign policy. According to Pope John Paul II, every created person has duties in addition to rights towards God, other people, themselves, their nation, society, and all of humanity. Like a prophet, he declared his confidence in God, people, the family, and the country, and he foresaw all the attacks against Christianity's very survival in the decades to come. He also mentioned the backlash he faced for standing up for the traditional family. More than any other pope, John Paul II spoke about marriage and family on his pastoral trips to the 5 continents. Although he received a lot of flack for it, he never shied away from discussing and defending church doctrine, which defines family as a partnership of love between a man and a woman. In addressing medical and bioethical concerns, the Pope issued a warning saying, "Life has a dignity that doesn't come from anyone but God." Pope John Paul II was declared a saint by the Roman Catholic Church on July 5, 2013, circumventing the customary 5-year waiting period following his passing. The canonization event was expected to occur within the next 16 months. Pope John XXV, who presided over the Catholic Church from 1958 until his death in 1963 and called for the Second Vatican Council, was also expected to be canonized, according to the Vatican. Pope Francis declared on September 30, 2013, that the canonizations of Pope John Paul II and Pope John XXV would take place on April 27, 2014. The Vatican disclosed that 2 miracles ascribed to the late Pope John Paul II preceded the announcement of his canonization. Sister Marie Simon-Pierre Normand, a dying French nun, was cured after confiding in Pope John Paul II during her struggle with Parkinson's disease, the same condition that claimed the Pope's life. In the second miracle, a 50-year-old woman claimed that a picture of Pope John Paul II had the power to heal her of a brain aneurysm. 4 popes participated in the official sainthood ceremony on April 27, 2014. Emeritus Pope Benedict, the predecessor of Pope Francis, was present at the ceremony to canonize Pope John Paul II and John 23. The love of God for a soul that is in love with him spreads like wildfire wherever it comes into contact. One tree lights up the next, and that lights up the next. A forest can catch fire from a single tiny spark. That's what Jesus longs for. That's what a person in love with God is capable of. However, there may be more struggles ahead for individuals who wish to spread God's love throughout the world. Because they detest the light of the gospel, those who oppose that fire have put up a fight against all saints. The saints are prepared for the spiritual war. They are powerful. It is God who has turned sinners into saints, but never wimps. A prime example of this is St. John Paul II, whose feast day is celebrated on October 22nd. His institution was shut down by the Nazi occupation forces, forcing young Carol to spend 5 years working in a chemical factory in Solvay and a quarry. During that period, he enrolled in classes at Krakow's covert seminary after realizing he was called to the priesthood. He was spied on by communists after he was ordained as a priest. He was shot by an assassin at the age of 60, and he almost died. He suffered from a femur fracture, an intestine tumor, and crippling Parkinson's disease as an older man, which eventually took away his ability to talk and left him bedridden. It isn't the tale of a strong man, but the fire of God's love that burned in his heart was what altered the world. Many Eastern European nations retreated from communism as a result of St. John Paul II's inspiration. He traveled the world on apostolic missions due to his fervor for the gospel. It's a divine fire. Therefore, no diseases, no Nazis, no communists, and no guns could put out that blaze. Wimps are not saints. Mary, Queen of all saints, grant us fortitude and dependability so that we can assist your Son in igniting this celestial fire. St. John Paul II frequently spoke out against the issues with secular culture throughout his lifetime as Pope. Many of these still exist in the modern world, which is why his advice on a wide range of subjects is so timeless. The outside world suggests that love is only found in greeting cards and chocolate boxes, or worse, that choosing love is a morally dubious feeling rather than a lifelong commitment. As followers of Christ, we are obligated to love in a way that goes above and beyond what is expected of us in society, as taught by St. John Paul II. The most important thing in life is that we love Christ and that we love him back. Everything else pales in contrast to the love of Jesus, and everything is meaningless without it. In the life of Pope John Paul II, we find a man who was sent by God, prepared by him, and appointed bishop and pope to lead God's church. He was a man of prayer, closeness, and justice. John Paul II's life is characterized by 3 distinct qualities: prayer, intimacy, and mercy. John Paul II managed to find time for prayer despite his busy schedule as Pope. St. John Paul II traveled the entire globe in search of the people. He was neither distant nor estranged from them. We can see how God was particularly near to his people already in the Old Testament. This closeness reached its zenith when Jesus became a man and lived among his people. John Paul drew near to both the big and the little, to those nearby and those geographically distant, imitating Jesus, the Good Shepherd. Although St. John Paul II was renowned for his love of justice, mercy balanced his love of justice. John Paul was therefore a man of mercy as well, for mercy and justice go hand in hand. John Paul, who made significant contributions to the devotion to divine mercy, held that God's justice has this kind of attitude and aspect. John Paul II died bearing a thick crucifixion. He handled it with dignity, but he carried it in accordance with Catholic bioethics, declining to use excessive force when it is evident that the moment had come for him to go to the Father's house. Recall that, like all men of Christ, John Paul II was a kind shepherd to us all. It is the responsibility of those who are left to take up the torch and continue following Christ.